These Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, builds on the success as well as address the shortcomings of the Millennium Developmental Goals, which, as you will remember, were adopted in 2000. And similar to the MDGs, the new SDGs will serve to galvanize the resources of energy and energy of the global community towards a set common goals focused on ending poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring prosperity for all by 2030. Now, in September 2013, world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development at the 70th UN Summit. And the agenda is made up of various parts, including the Declaration, the 17 Sustainable Developmental Goals, and the 169 targets. The SDGs officially came into effect on the 1st January 2016. Over the 15-year period to 2030, with these new goals in place that universally apply to all countries, we are expected to mobilize efforts to end all forms of poverty and address inequalities. And we have to ensure that no one is left behind. As I noted, the SDGs also address what was not achieved by the Millennium Developmental Goals, and in that respect, this SDGs built on the 8 Millennium Developmental Goals. Many are an extension or a combination of the MDG goals and indicators. The 2030 vision include ending poverty and hunger everywhere, combating inequalities within and among countries, building peaceful, just and inclusive societies, protecting human rights and promoting gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and ensuring the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. This vision is anchored and guided by the aims and principles of, amongst others, the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international human rights treaties, the Millennium Declaration, and the 2005 World Summit Outcome document. And in this way, it affirms the outcomes and principles outlined in major UN conferences and summits, including that of common but differentiated responsibilities. It emphasizes that the Sustainable Development Agenda of people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership now and in the future is indivisible. It further affirms that the call for eradicating poverty, combating inequality, preserving the planet, creating sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, and fostering social inclusions are interlinked and are interdependent. It is important to note that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development also reflects South Africa's National Development Plan 2030, as well as the AU Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. We find, therefore, that the broad goals outlined in the NDP 2030, the SDGs, and the AU Agenda 2063 are fundamentally the same, and that all the goals seek to combat inequality, eradicate poverty in all its forms, and deal with unemployment through sustainable and inclusive economic growth without leaving anyone behind. In the same way as we committed to the attainment of the MDG, South Africa participated actively through this process of finalizing the SDGs. And it may be apt for me to add that we conducted an extensive audit of South Africa's implementation of the Millennium Developmental Goals, and we actually scored into the positive with regards to many of the stipulated goals of the Millennium Development. Our participation in the finalization of the SDGs was primarily in our capacity as chair of the Group of 77 and China at that time. In this capacity, we were able to lead and protect the interest of developing countries, particularly during the final leg of negotiations. In addition, it was through South Africa's efforts that as a co-facilitator at the 2013 United Nations General Assembly special event of the Millennium Developmental Goals that we were able to ensure that negotiations took place in an open, transparent, member state-driven process. South Africa also proposed and supported the appointment of a fellow African, Ambassador Machari Kamau, a permanent representative at Kenya Mission to United Nations, as a co-facilitator of the intergovernmental goals. Currently, we find ourselves in the context where the global and continental agendas for sustainable development goals have progressed from the conceptualization to the implementation phase. Parallel to SDGs implementation, in the first 10-year implementation plan for the AU, Agenda 2063, adopted in January 2015, has begun. And in addition, as you are no doubt aware, since adopting the NDP in 2012 as the roadmap for South Africa's future, we're in the process of implementation through the medium-term strategy framework. So the NDP is being implemented. And continuously, the whole of government reports on a quarterly basis to our department, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and those reports are processed and presented to Cabinet, and they are also made public. So I think we need to deal with the notion that the NDP is sitting somewhere gathering dust. So on an annual basis, all government departments prepare their annual performance plan, and it is on the basis of this annual performance plan that we look at whether are they consistent with the National Development Plan. And in that way, we consequently look at as to whether we as a country are also consistently implementing the sustainable developmental goals, and also what our contribution towards Agenda 2063 has become. It is, of course, going to be difficult to get all the political parties to agree on a national development plan. And I think one of the decisions that government took was that let's continue implementing that which we agree on. And everything else, we will have to continuously engage, but the possibility of obviously finding general consensus on a national development plan, and given the conflicting interests locally, it's almost near impossible. And I think the fact that most political parties and most in our country agree that the National Development Plan represent a vision which they can rally behind is for us critical. Now, furthermore, to ensure alignment and progress with our commitments, South Africa has also commenced with the incorporation of both Agenda 2063 and the SDGs in our national development plans by developing clear linkages between our national, continental, and global agendas to allow for integrated and systematic monitoring and review processes at all levels. And again, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that the implementation of the, or rather the attainment of the sustainable developmental goals, as we've also seen with the Millennium Developmental Goals, are not without global political contestation and global interest. Obviously, many of the African countries dependent on budgetary support and all of that are unlikely going to be attaining those, and a whole range of other factors. And I think the drive for the AU Agenda 2063 as a united program of all African countries, and also a way within which that Agenda 2063 can be resourced by all African countries is one of the ways and one of the platforms within which we see as a country that we can help drive the whole continent towards attaining the goals, the sustainable developmental goals. Now, South Africa, through Statistics South Africa, has developed an integrated indicator framework to outline the alignment of the NDP indicators in the medium-term strategy framework. Agenda 2063, specifically its first 10 years of implementation, and also the SDGs. The framework will be expanded this year to to include provincial development plans and also IDPs. The indicator framework provides a clear basis for understanding what has to be addressed in planning as well as monitoring and evaluation of the goals contained in the post-2015 development agenda. We've undertaken this work not only to evaluate the process that we're making as a country in terms of improving the lives of all our people, but because we're keenly aware that as a democratic country, we form part of the global community with rights and responsibilities. And in this regard, the UN process requires that all countries develop a baseline report covering the suite of indicators that they will be able to track during the 15 years between 2016 and 2030. Since the indicators have to be based on the country's own developmental agenda, it would be obvious that certain SDG indicators may not be relevant for South Africa. And equally, others have to be amended to reflect our country's unique circumstances, while additional indicators may have to be added to adequately cover our national situation. These amended or additional indicators, referred to as domesticated indicators, will be measured and reported on within the South African Indicator Baseline Report and all subsequent progress reports to that effect. And that the SDGs are obviously a baseline, or at least the bare minimum that we should be able to achieve. And I think some of the points that Dr. Posa was referring to, which are contained in both the NDP and also in the Freedom Charter about the South Africa we need, represents what we ultimately, or a vision which we ultimately all should be pursuing. Consultations have obviously started so that that the SDG indicators are amalgamated and incorporated to reflect the specificities of our country. The consultations followed a bottom-up approach to ensure that no one is left behind during these engagements. And that the information or the data for the SDGs will come from Stats SA, as indicated, line ministries, the private sector, and civil society. And in this respect, sectoral working groups have been established to deal with data access and quality from the different data sources have been identified. It is crucial that I reiterate, in addition to the technical work being undertaken in terms of reporting, that we have a strong political commitment to ensure that we end poverty and hunger everywhere, that we combat inequalities within and amongst countries, that we build peaceful, just and inclusive, and an inclusive society, that we protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources, and that government alone cannot be able to attain all of these commitments. I'm restating this not only because we have obligations in terms of our international commitments, but, as stated earlier, but because these goals form part of the National Development Plan. It is equally important to remember that the commitment to these principles go back even further and can be traced to the rights enshrined in our founding documents of our democracy, which is the Constitution. Having said that, I want to stress that as South Africans, we are committed to a global partnership to ensure the implementation of the post-2015 development agenda and to establishing a process for the follow-up and review at the national, regional, and global level of the progress made in implementing the goals and targets over the next 14 years. There's an acute awareness amongst our leaders in this country and on our continent that development rests in our own hand. It should be noted, however, that while leaders can adopt resolutions and make declarations, unless the people take up the opportunities, the resolutions will remain words on paper. I thank you.
Vision 2030, the National Development Plan. It's our future. Let's go for it, man.